the second conference of Howrah Town Diabetes Study Society on the theme Diabetes and Family. Let's start with some positive energy as it was Swamiji's birthday yesterday. So what he had shared with us is, the more we come out and do good to others, the more our hearts will be purified and God will be in them. This pledge was taken by Howrah Town Diabetes Study Society itself, and let me introduce a bit about them. Howrah Town Diabetes Study Society was founded by a group of 9 enthusiastic doctors interested in diabetes and its related complications. The aim of this group is to raise awareness about diabetes, conduct social, scientific programs to enhance learning and apply new knowledge for the betterment of the society. I hope everybody can see the glimpses of what Howrah Town Diabetes Study Society has done so far, going just behind in the backdrop. I would just like to mention few important programs by them till now. The first conference that was held on Doctors' Day last year, and the second one was on World Diabetes Day, where they had culminated people from all spheres of the society, be it patients, be it a local man, be it doctors, and it was a huge successful program. So a big round of applause for Howrah Town Diabetes Study Society. Well, I would request everyone if you kindly take your seats. So there's one question for all my delegates over here. That is, what can be the original, mood-altering and non-fattening wonder drug available in this world? If anyone may come up with your answer. Absolutely, sir. It's music. And what is music? Music is the natural medicine for the body, the mind, and the soul. A universal frequency and vibration resonating and harmonizing our being with all that is and ever will be. Now, think of this thing, how interesting it will be if this wonder drug is brought to us by a doctor and a musician himself. Won't that be great? So, keeping this in mind, let us all welcome Dr. Siddhartha Shankar Rai. Well, I don't think this name, everybody is familiar with this name or not. So we welcome you, Dr. Siddhartha Shankar Rai.
Good morning.
Mainly known as Shidhu, who is the frontman of Cactus. He's a wonderful singer and a musician. We welcome you, Sidhu. Thank you so much for being with us. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning to you all. It is definitely a big pleasure and a very big honor to be here. Thank you so much, Howrah Town Diabetes Study Society, for inviting me this morning. It's difficult to choose a topic to talk on. Definitely, I won't be silly enough to talk on diabetes with all the learned friends and the seniors present out here. Definitely, I won't be talking about that. But still, I would love to say thanks to all the doctors and the dietitians who keep on saying that do some bit of exercise. From here, I'll be going to Kharagpur for a performance. And, our performances are very energetic ones. I jump and run around the stage. So, and I should be admitting that I'm on the wrong side of the 40s. But still, I kind of managed to create that amount of energy up on stage. And thanks to all of your advices that do some bit of exercise every day. So, I have made it a point since last couple of years that I would at least walk for 30 to 40 minutes, if not do a bit of jogging too. So this has really done magic on me, on my health, and I have realized that exercise, lifestyle modification is essential. I have realized this from my heart, from my brain, and from the cells and the tissues of my body. So thanks to your advice to all the doctors and the dietitians. A dietitian friend is out here who was the basic connect with your association. Stress, reduce stress. It is very easy to say reduce stress, but again, thanks to music, that music can actually de-stress a person. Yes, it is a very speedy life. We are all running with our mottos and ambitions and goals and duties and jobs. We are doing multitasking every day. But at the same time, we should be keeping at least 15 to 20 minutes to listen to music. Yes, over the years, the lifestyle changes in the society has been like this, that there is consumption of music. This is a study says the consumption of music has not reduced, rather it has increased, but listening to music has gone down. It's a very oxymoron kind of thing. Say we keep on the FM stations on our cars whenever we drive, but do we actually pay attention and concentrate on that music? No, but we consume music at that moment. So consumption of music has increased, but listenership to music has really gone down. I think this is not a very healthy situation for the society and the health of the people. So listening to music with concentration, with attention for at least 10 to 15 minutes each day is very, very important. So that's all I can say. I usually lead a very selfish kind of life, concerned only about my happiness and sorrows, my duties and my work and my shows, etc., TV shootings. But at the same time, I make it a point whenever I see or get notice something good happening, people are working for the society, I definitely try to participate. Say multiple sclerosis is such a virulent disease. So just last Sunday I had been to a picnic where the people participating in that picnic were only the patients or the family members of multiple sclerosis. Multiple Sclerosis Society of India, MSSI. So that is again a very human body. They have a lot of heart because, you know, the patients of such diseases get into such nervous weaknesses. So it was a wonderful time spending time with them. And again, I say today, since such an attempt has been made to spread the awareness and discuss the developments regarding the treatment of diabetes, I'm gladly here. I won't be talking anymore. I was supposed to give a musical performance. The itinerary says a musical performance. I'm even carrying my guitar, but there is some technical issues regarding the sound. I don't think they were enough informed that a musical performance will happen, so even the guitar cannot be connected. So I'll just sing a couple of lines for you, definitely. This is a song from the film Uma that got released last year. And this song talks about a team game. Since HTDSS, they are a team, a wonderful team, and such a conference can only be successful by a solid team game. So I dedicate this to all the members of HTDSS. কিসের ডাকে পথে নেমেছি, কে বা ভবিষ্যৎ দেখেছি, কাঁধে কাঁধ মেলাও, হাতে হাত মেলাও, এসো বন্ধু। আসুক বিপদ আসুক বাধা, সামনে থাক গোলক ধাঁধা, কাঁধে কাঁধ মেলাও, হাতে হাত মেলাও, এসো বন্ধু। আকাশ যতই ভয় দেখাক তুমি থেমো না, সবাই আশা ছেড়ে দিলেও তুমি ছেড়ো না। এসো আমার সঙ্গে এসো আজ, সেজে এসো তোমার যুদ্ধ সাজ, হাত নেড়ে ডাকছি তোমায় আজ, ফেলে রেখে এসো তোমার সমস্ত কাজ, আমাদের হাতে সময় অল্প তাই, এসো বন্ধু সবাই হাত লাগাই, এসো আমার সঙ্গে এসো আজ, সেজে এসো তোমার যুদ্ধ সাজ। পাঁচটা আঙুল হলে একসাথে তাজমহল বানিয়ে ফেলি এক রাতে, কাঁধে কাঁধ মেলাও, হাতে হাত মেলাও, এসো বন্ধু। This is a composition by Anupam Rai. The lyrics and the music is by Anupam Rai, and such wonderful lyrics I would like to repeat. পাঁচটা আঙুল হলে একসাথে তাজমহল বানিয়ে ফেলি এক রাতে, কাঁধে কাঁধ মেলাও, হাতে হাত মেলাও, এসো বন্ধু। ভেঙে পড়ো না এত অল্পতেই পরিশ্রমের বিকল্প নেই, কাঁধে কাঁধ মেলাও, হাতে হাত মেলাও, এসো বন্ধু। আকাশ যতই ভয় দেখাক তুমি থেমো না, সবাই আশা ছেড়ে দিলেও তুমি ছেড়ো না। এসো আমার সঙ্গে এসো আজ, সেজে এসো তোমার যুদ্ধ সাজ, হাত নেড়ে ডাকছি তোমায় আজ, ফেলে রেখে এসো তোমার সমস্ত কাজ। আমাদের হাতে সময় অল্প তাই, এসো বন্ধু সবাই হাত লাগাই, এসো আমার সঙ্গে এসো আজ, সেজে এসো তোমার যুদ্ধ সাজ। Thank you everybody, and have a very wonderful and successful conference session. Love and regards to you all.
Thank you so much, Shidhu, for energizing us so much. I think this will keep us going throughout the day. I hope everyone is with me. This will keep us going throughout the day. Yes. A big round of applause for Shidhu. Thank you, Shidhu, for coming and joining with us. Okay. So the lamp lighting session will be a little later since our guest of honor has not yet arrived. So we will directly move on to our scientific session. So first, we are going to start with a very important topic. It's depression in diabetes. Diabetes and depression occur together approximately twice as frequently as would be predicted by chance alone. So today, the status that we are in, stress has affected us so badly that this needs a proper treatment and care. So, to observe this beautiful scientific topic, let us welcome Dr. Alokananda Datta, who is our speaker for today, who is a renowned psychiatrist attached to AMRI Dhakuria. And to chair the sessions, we invite Dr. S.K. Somani, who is a very senior reputed neurologist of Howrah, and founder member and member of Scientific Affairs HDS, and Dr. A.K. Majumdar, ex-HOD Department of Medicine, Medical College, Kolkata, and who has a huge academic interest. We welcome Dr. Alokananda Datta as the speaker, and chairpersons Dr. S.K. Somani and Dr. A.K. Majumdar.
So welcome everybody. The first talk is on depression in diabetes. A bidirectional association between the two is well recognized, though depression continues to be underdiagnosed and undertreated condition in diabetes. Dr. Alokananda Datta will enlighten us about this talk. Dr. Datta, please.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to first take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to talk before you, and especially my good friend, Dr. Shoikat, for calling me up and remembering me. So we will be talking on, as you all know, a very important topic, that is depression in diabetes mellitus. Let us first look at this 55-year-old gentleman who had a diagnosis of diabetes mellitus for approximately 8 years, along with chronic kidney disease for 2 years. For the last 6 months, he was having persistent burning sensation of his whole body, with the episodic exacerbations of this burning, along with breathlessness, tremors, and fear of impending doom. For the last 1 month, it became so terrible that the poor gentleman had to get hospitalized under a combined team of nephrologist and endocrinologist in a general hospital. On history, it was evident that he had similar episode of lesser severity after the diagnosis of his kidney disease 2 years ago, which improved within 4 months with escitalopram 10 milligram per day. However, the same drug at even a higher dose of 20 milligram per day did not help him over a period of 3 months in the current episode. Suspecting, after going through a thorough examination and investigation, the treating physician suspected that he was suffering from diabetes and gave a referral to psychiatry, where, as a psychiatrist, what I found was there was this gentleman who had an insidious onset of the following symptoms, characterized by mood symptoms like anxiety, crying spells, decreased interest, cognitive symptoms like decreased concentration and confidence, ideas of hopelessness, somatic symptoms like difficulty in sleeping and decreased appetite, and all this had contributed in his inability to go to work for the last 4 to 5 weeks. So the diagnosis of recurrent depressive disorder, currently moderate depressive episode, was entertained, and he was treated with sertraline 150 milligram, and actually all his symptoms, including the burning sensation, responded significantly well with this treatment over a period of 2 months. And currently, it's been a year down the line, he's maintaining very well. Now, if you look at this sort of ranking system, it sort of reminds us of the countdowns of the musical videos we see on MTV or 9XM, where diabetes, maybe some of you are feeling pretty happy, has risen from rank 9 to rank 4 over the last 2 decades, while depression has maintained its high position from 4 to 3 over the same period of time. But there is nothing for us to add. This is actually a matter of concern and problem, because we are actually talking about the causes of all age disability worldwide. So what really goes, we are now talking about 2 disorders who are the 3rd and 4th cause of disability for all people of all ages in the world, and these 2 coming together is definitely something we would not like. However much we would like to avoid having a depressed patient in our clinic, the prevalence rate of depression is very high in diabetes patients as compared to those in the general population, with rising to up to 3 times higher in type 1 and 2 times higher in type 2. And the prevalence ranges from 10 to 30% in the world population. Depression is found to be more prevalent in not only diabetes that is diagnosed, but also in those that has not been diagnosed. And patients treated for diabetes have a higher odds of developing depressive symptoms during the follow-up period. Again, depression itself is associated with a 60% increase in type 2 diabetes. So it is a two-way bimodal association that we see between these 2 disorders. If you look at the prevalence studies conducted in India, a recent review has shown that it varies widely from 2 to 84%, with type 2 diabetes mellitus having a higher prevalence in the northern states as compared to the southern. Complications of diabetes like neuropathy, nephropathy, retinopathy, and coronary artery disease have a significant association with depression, and the absence of microvascular complication reduces the chance of depression. However, there are longitudinal and controlled studies from India are quite few, and the Indian data regarding the relationship between type 1 diabetes and depression is sparse. Amongst the risk factors that have been seen across studies in India as well as the world, we see that socio-demographic factors like advanced age, female gender, low literacy rate, lower socioeconomic status, rural domicile, and marriage are important factors resulting in comorbidity. Duration of diabetes greater than 2 years, diabetes-related complications, poor glycemic control are the diabetes-related factors, and individual factors like past history of major depressive disorder, sedentary life without adequate physical activities, lack of self-care often precipitates type 2 diabetes in patients and vice versa. Now, the question that arises in our mind is, why is depression so common in diabetes and vice versa? The most common answer is that diabetes, being a chronic physical condition, is associated with regular medical checkups, treatment, lifestyle modifications, which adds a burden to the life of the individual, and as a consequence, we have depression. However, if we look further, we see that type 1 diabetes has higher prefrontal glutamine GABA levels than the healthy control subjects, and this correlates with mild depressive symptoms. Depression is commonly associated with modification of these neurotransmitters in the brain. Again, autoimmune diabetes, a very common cause of type 1 diabetes, has increased circulating cytokines, and lack of insulin affects the neurogenesis and neurotransmitter symptoms in the developing period. Again, chronic hyperglycemia and iatrogenic hypoglycemia in the patients of type 1 diabetes can lead to hyperactivity of the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis. So it has been proposed that stress system may be a key candidate for the common pathway for these 2 disorders. Again, let us look into another hypothesis where we are trying to say that both diabetes and depression have a common etiology. This cannot be explained by genetic factors because they do not have any common genes. However, epigenetic factors common to both depression and diabetes, like low socioeconomic status, poor sleep, lack of physical exercises, and diet, may contribute to again forming the activation of the stress system, another candidate for the common pathway even in type 2 diabetes. So let us see how stress can lead to both diabetes and depression. We all know that stress leads to the activation of the hypothalamo-pituitary adrenal axis with release of cortisols and catecholamines from the adrenal gland. The catecholamines will cause insulin resistance, obesity, metabolic syndrome, and in turn lead to type 2 diabetes. Again, they will also cause anxiety, anorexia, or hyperphagia, tachyphylaxis to the reward system and inability to feel pleasure, leading to depression. Again, you will have more pro-inflammatory cytokines being released by the brain system during a stress response, as a result of which this can hinder the function of the pancreatic beta cells, leading to insulin resistance and finally diabetes. Again, the same pro-inflammatory cytokines can cause initial increase followed by reduction in the neurotransmitter metabolism, neuroendocrine functions, synaptic plasticity, alteration of behavior, and finally depression. Again, the brain therefore seems to be the common pathway where we see the meeting of depression, diabetes, and stress, with stress causing excess cortisol resulting in disturbed neurogenesis, especially in the hippocampal formation, an area which is also affected by reduction of volumes in especially diabetes, with hypo and hyperperfusion, cerebral atrophy, etc. And finally, depression affects neurodegeneration, leads to neurodegeneration in prefrontal cortex, and again, our favorite hippocampal formation. So all this could be one of the common etiopathogenesis leading to depression and diabetes. Again, having depression increases your risk of developing diabetes because sedentary lifestyles of these patients, their tendency to take diets rich in saturated fats and refined sugars, avoidance of fruits and vegetables leads to the increased risk. They are also more likely to be poorly adherent to their treatment regimes, and noradrenergic antidepressants, especially the tricyclic antidepressants, etc., which we commonly use for treatment of depression, may lead to impaired insulin sensitivity even in a non-diabetic individual, precipitating the onset of depression. Now that we know that depression is common in diabetes, we know it's a problem, we must realize that the consequences are pretty broad in the form of depression worsening everything associated with diabetes, extending from the glycemic control to the complications, to quality of life, work productivity, utilization of healthcare, and the costs as well as mortality. Again, diabetes itself increases the suicidal risk and the failure to respond to treatment in depression. So they both have a two-way reaction in their outcomes and consequences too. And this recent study, which was conducted over 14 countries, have revealed a very startling news which gives us enough reason to worry. Despite this high prevalence, the knowledge of the correlates, the proportion of patients with a diagnosis of current major depressive disorder who had a diagnosis or any treatment for depression recorded in their medical records are extremely low and almost non-existent in many countries. So as we have been told previously by our chairperson, the depression often goes undiagnosed and these people continue to suffer silently. Although the American Diabetes Association guidelines of 2018 recommends that psychosocial screening for depression, anxiety, etc. should be conducted at the initial visit and annual visits of every person with diagnosis of diabetes. So what are the screening instruments available? lots of alphabets around, but some of the very common ones are, of course, the first one, Patient Health Questionnaire 9, Beck Depression Inventory, the Hospital Anxiety Depression Scale, the CESD. These are pretty common scales which are used, which are self-reporting instruments given to the patient, or you can administer them yourselves. However, amongst them, the PHQ-9 is probably the most, I find it the most easily used scale in the community, where you have and it's also validated in the Indian languages, and you have a pretty low specificity as compared to the others. As a result, the possibility of having false positives are low. In order to ensure that we get a better screening with PHQ-9, we can also increase, we have cutoff scores for depression, which we can increase from 10 to 12 when we are dealing with comorbid conditions like depression, like diabetes. Now, however, there are lots of barriers when it comes to detecting depression in a patient who presents with chronic physical illness. First and foremost, it's the patient himself or herself who does not wish to talk about his or her emotional problems before a doctor he or she has consulted for a somatic disease. The doctors and nurses themselves are not more oriented towards somatic symptoms of depression rather than the emotional problems. And the somatic symptoms of depression, like fatigue, the palpitation, anxiety-related palpitation, etc., cold sweats, can be mistaken as symptoms of diabetes rather than depression itself. Again, the screening questionnaires that we talked about have a lot of restrictions too. A lot of our patients are illiterates. There are a lot of, the lack of cultural equivalence for content of the questionnaires are often making it difficult for their application. And finally, the most important thing, if you end up having a lot of false positive patients who are actually not diagnosed, you are leading to unnecessary diagnostic efforts and referrals, which is time consuming to the patient as well as the healthcare professionals and leading to increased cost of healthcare system. So to avoid unnecessary screening, especially for people in India, we would recommend that we should at least screen for depression in those patients with diabetes who are females, living alone, have late or acute complications, experiencing a critical life event in the recent past, and those with poor glycemic control. Two very common questions that has shown a very high rate of recognizing depression in the primary care setting is asking your patient whether in the last 2 months they have been bothered by feeling depressed, low, or hopeless, or they have felt little interest or pleasure in doing things. Just ask one of these questions. If any of them is true, they should actually be screened and go through a proper evaluation for depression. Now, what happens if we diagnose depression in diabetes? We should treat both of them at the same time. And its treatment of depression should definitely be given a priority. And we should know that the response to antidepressants usually takes 2 to 4 weeks to occur. So we cannot discontinue the medicine unless it is continued for at least 6 weeks before we say that it is not being effective in treating depression. However, the improvement in glycemic controls and levels of HbA1c needs several months to settle down even after controlling depression, and improvement in mood, however, may lead to better compliance to your diabetic treatment. Now, if we go by a stepped care model which has been proposed by many guidelines, especially the NICE, where we are saying that all known and suspected presentations of diabetes should actually receive assessment, support, and psychoeducation, especially to provide skills and knowledge for effective coping with diabetes, stress management, relaxation and biofeedback, etc., which help in significant reduction in anxiety and depressive symptoms and increase psychological well-being. Low-intensity therapies like group physical activities, group-based peer support are also very useful. Actually, they are telling us that mild depression and subthreshold depressive symptoms should not be treated by antidepressants. So the erstwhile, our favorite Nexito, and that is escitalopram, should not be the first line of treatment when we are suspecting depression. And we can also go for, when we are treating for moderate to severe depression, definitely we do go for antidepressants. And of course, there are various structured treatments like group-based or individual cognitive behavior therapy, which can be done by trained psychiatrists and psychologists. Now, the use of antidepressants in diabetes is also hindered by several other factors that we have to keep into consideration. That is, these patients have additional physical health disorders. The antidepressants may impact the underlying physical disease, like SSRIs, that is escitalopram, sertraline, have a very high rate of exacerbation of hyponatremia, especially in older individuals. They interact with other medicines that you're using, especially most of our drugs work through the cytochrome P450. No evidence as yet for supporting the use of any specific antidepressant for patients with diabetes mellitus. However, we would recommend that the noradrenergic drugs be generally avoided. Now, if you look at the efficacy of giving coordinated treatment for both depression and diabetes, there are sufficient reviews to support the use of antidepressants or psychotherapy, because they do definitely improve the depression score. However, when it comes to glycemic control, there is a dicey situation which may not lead to directly predict a better glycemic control. Now there are lots of work being done in this field, and we see that there is this recent model that has come up in the UK, especially in the West, where we see that they are integrating the medical, that is treatment of diabetes, the psychological and psychiatric aspects, as well as social care, that is the socioeconomic conditions of the patients are being taken into consideration in order to ensure that they have a better adherence and outcome in diabetes control, and the pilot phases have been actually very, very successful. Again, there's this enhanced intervention, which actually means that you are trying to take the patient's perspective in mind regarding the value he or she gives to the factors that would be important for him to adhere to the treatment for both diabetes and depression and the other areas that is bothering him. So, and it has been seen that apart from just giving medication, these sort of things really do help the patient not only in glycemic control but also in depressive symptom control. So we can conclude that depression is often comorbid with diabetes, and the possible causes could be many, though we are not very sure, but we should be thinking of burden of the chronic disease, common stress pathways, medication side effects. Unfortunately, the overall outcome becomes worse when they are together, and the psychological interventions as simple as spending time with your patients, telling them about what they are suffering from, their treatment and their outcome, usually improves the overall well-being. Though antidepressants are useful in diabetes with depression, we should be cautious about their use. And finally, the last but most important topic, it is a team effort, and it's a multidisciplinary effort that helps these individuals to lead a better life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Datta, for a well presented presentation, and we are well on time.
And this is the prize question, sir.
And now we can ask questions, if any.
First question comes from the speaker herself. This is a prize question.
So there is an important and interesting announcement actually. So the first question comes from the speaker herself, and we have a prize for the best answer. But one trick is there. Everybody who is member of HDS would not get a prize, but it's open for all other delegates present here.
All of them.
Ma'am, over to you.
All of them is the best answer.
Yes.
So you can't give it, sir. You will not get the prize. That's right. When should patients with diabetes be definitely screened for depression? When they have acute complications, late complications, experience of a critical life event in the past, poor glycemic control, all of the above.
Who is the doctor who wants to stand up and say that it is all of the above? Then you'll get the prize. Otherwise, you'll not get the prize. Come on, somebody needs to volunteer. If you're wearing a red coat, you can't get the prize. All of the above. Madam, your name?
Pamela Ghosh.
Pamela Ghosh. Big hand to Pamela.
Big hand for Pamela Ghosh.
Prize. So it's a gift card for you, which you can basically shop around when you like. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thanks. That's how it should go.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alokananda Datta, for sharing your detailed discussion, and it was a wonderful presentation. And any questions from our audiences? Our session is open for questions and answers for 5 more minutes.
No, I think before that, on behalf of chairpersons, I'm sorry that I come late, but I think this endeavor of choosing this topic, particularly depression and diabetes, I think is not a very commonly discussed topic. In the background of internal medicine, we see in various clinical meetings in diabetology and also internal medicine, this is the first time, also a rare occasion, where we see mental health discussion, and also in a very methodical and timely fashion. I think it's very, very credit goes not only to the honorable speaker, but also to the whole organization, particularly Dr. Sanjay Shah, I think, and the whole team. But I think I just came yesterday from Mumbai from some personal work. I'm internal medicine I'm doing, and you have talked of many things about depression, diabetes, particularly the neurohumoral modulation. I think that's very, very important. Many things you do not know. Now about the screening you told, yes, not only in the adult population, but also pediatric population, particularly type 1 and juvenile diabetes. A lot of problem, particularly schooling hours. You know, I have got my relative detected type 1 diabetes at the age of 1 year, 1 month. And now she's in Mumbai, stayed in Mumbai. At 11 years, lot of problem in schooling, not only management strategy, but also the psychological problems. So I think it is also another important component of our therapy, of our screening in the pediatric population. Also, we are getting young diabetics also in the pediatrics population. So naturally, not only adult population. Now coming to elderly, because I belong to stream of elderly medicine, I am dealing with geriatric medicine. I know that there are 3 Ds. Number 1, depression. Number 2, your diabetic distress. I think distress is also another important topic, which is frequently discussed in the various ADA meetings, etc. And also come in the topic of ADA, diabetic distress, and also dementia. So there are 3 Ds. Besides that, acute problem is delusion. So know the sort of electrolyte imbalance, hyperglycemia, hypoglycemia, lot of problem, mental problem. And until we internists, not only internists, but also many of us are very common practitioners in the community. So I think we have to deal with these sort of problems, and you have nicely focused, Dr. Ratto. I must congratulate you for your very timely, and you have focused many things, which practically enlightens all of us.
Thank you.
So I think I have taken time. Dr. Sanjay is very strict in time, I think, but we are just in time. So I think there should have been some more questions.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, Dr. Sanjay. Please take the mic, Dr. Sanjay, sir.
As a clinician, what's a reasonably good antidepressant for patients who have got diabetes, which will not affect their glycemic control?
Exactly. The same questions I was trying to ask.
The SSRIs would be should be the first line of treatment. You can start with either escitalopram or sertraline. Both of them are quite good.
Sertraline up to what dose?
Sertraline, the minimum effective dose is 100. You can go up to 200. And you have to give them time. Like the medicines usually take 4 to 6 weeks to 2 to 3 weeks to start their onset of action. And in order to say that your patient is not responding, you have to at least wait for 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, because otherwise it will be of no use. Same with escitalopram, it's 10 to 20. But if you are dealing with an elderly person who's above 60, it's better to start at half the dose, like go for 50 milligrams sertraline, and do not try to hike beyond 100, 150 if you are dealing with elderly people, unless you have a psychiatric support, because that is a problem there.
How to view the amitriptyline group of drugs, particularly elderly population? I think don't use.
No, nowadays we really do avoid it because it is associated with
lot
so
of
many
problems.
side effects.
Yes, I think that also is very important
Yeah,
to
the
all of
cardiac
us.
side effects, the diabetes also goes out of control, so it's
Yeah, yes.
exactly.
Yeah, so I think that is a message that should be focused
Exactly.
from here, that we are using
Amitriptyline,
these sort of
this
drugs.
amixide H is a very common
Now,
drug.
I
which
think
is
I
used in
was reading one
general.
article where it says that sertraline is rather moderately effective. Other antidepressants, there's a lot of queries. So, do you agree on that point?
See, my experience, see, actually, if you look at the evidence base, there is really nothing to actually support any particular drug. But if we see our clinical experience and the side effect profile, because when we are choosing a drug, we are thinking of the side effects and the interactions. Sertraline definitely is a very good drug when you are thinking of a chronic physical condition.
Okay.
Again, but if you are dealing with an elderly person, you should be very well aware that you can have hyponatremia and bleeding episodes. So we should constantly be monitoring that, because the patient is getting drowsy and lethargic and you are thinking it's depression, go on hiking the dose and the patient gets more hyponatremic. So these are things you have to keep in mind.
SSRIs are preferable to SNRIs, number one. And in elderly people that we usually deal with, one should go slow and go slow.
Exactly.
So, I think with that, we must congratulate once again Dr. Nanta and Dr. Somani with me and the whole organization. I must congratulate all of you, sir, for your nice presentation, and also stick to time. Thank you.
Thank you
think
so
this
much,
session
sir,
is closed.
Dr. A.K. Majumdar and Dr. S.K. Somani, for your valuable comments. And thank you, Dr. Alokananda Datta, for your valuable speech. With this, we move on to the second part of our scientific session. And the topic is fatty liver, the physician's perspective. And to go on with the topic, we have our very honorable speaker, Dr. Dilip Todi, who is a member Scientific Affairs of HTS and also the founding member of HTS. And he is the leading gastroenterologist of Howrah, founder member of Old West Bank Hospital, presently known as Narayana Super Speciality Hospital. And to chair the session, I would like to invite Dr. Buddhadev Mukherjee, who is one of the senior most medicine consultant attached to Narayana Super Speciality Hospital, and Dr. Shoikot Ghosh, who is also a founder member and assistant treasurer HTS. He is young, enthusiastic medical person with interest in pain and rehabilitation medicine and the proprietor of Astha Pain Clinic in Howrah. I welcome all of you on the stage, and I welcome our speaker, Dr. Dilip Todi, to carry on with this session.
Good morning, everybody. Respected my friends and colleagues, Happy New Year to all of you. Now, the subject of discussion, no less than by Dr. Dilip Todi, one of the renowned gastroenterologists of the city, and I hope he will discuss everything of fatty liver, which is very common, and you find in every ultrasonography, I think almost every day, if there is nothing, only there is change of fatty liver, which is very common in 30 to 46% of American people, and also male, female equally affected, and as you know, it contains all sorts of metabolic syndrome, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, and polycystic ovarian syndrome. And with these few words, I request our respected speaker, Dr. Dilip Todi, one of the famous gastroenterologists, to place before you the fatty liver subject. Thank you very much, Dr. Todi. Thank you very much, audience.
Respected chairpersons, friends and colleagues. You see, as Dr. Buddhadev Mukherjee pointed out, most of the patients that we see in our clinic, especially myself, being a gastroenterologist, and most of the physicians, when the patients enter our clinic, a lot of them bring in an ultrasound. And they are worried, they have a worried look on their face, and they ask us, "Amar liver ki holo? What happened to my liver?" Because they have a report which says fatty liver. And because it is a cultural thing for us, because we are very, very, very worried about our liver. I hope to try and tell you a little more about what is fatty liver, and what to do about fatty liver, and what to think and not to think about fatty liver. I suspect, as I have been practicing for the last 20 years, we are seeing more and more of fatty liver. A part of the problem of the fatty liver is because of this. As our diet has changed, we are seeing more and more of fatty liver. And probably in the next few years, we will see more and more of it. If you go back to the history, Ludwig was the first one to really coin the term fatty liver in 1980 in Mayo. He was a pathologist. He first described it in a liver biopsy. And it is currently coined as if you have more than 5% of the liver has fat, it is described on liver biopsy, it is described as a fatty liver. The caveat is you must be taking less than 20 grams of alcohol, because alcohol itself can cause fatty liver. So if you're taking less than the prescribed amount of alcohol and you have fat in the liver, then you have fatty liver. MRI is the most sensitive technique to detect liver, fatty liver. MR spectroscopy or MRI PDFF, proton density fat fraction, is the gold standard to detect fat from the imaging perspective, because it detects fat when there is only 6% fat in the liver. But as you can understand, MRI is a very expensive technique. It is not very widely available. And for spectroscopy, you need an added hardware, but MRI PDFF, you need just a software. So most of the MRI machine can detect with this software fat in the liver. Ultrasound detects fat in the liver when there is more than 20% fat in the liver. CT scan has the same sensitivity as ultrasound, but you have to have ionizing radiation for CT scan. As you can see, on the left-hand panel, on the left-hand side here, on your right, on your left, sorry, it is a normal liver. On your right is a fatty liver. I don't want to cast aspersion on my radiological colleagues, but you have to be careful when somebody comes with you with a fatty liver diagnosis on an ultrasound, but you have to be a bit careful because there are certain criteria which has to be met. Because what you have to understand is, what they see is ultrasound picture, what you see is it is like a TV monitor. If you just tweak a knob, it becomes bright. And a fatty liver is a bright liver. But there are certain criteria which have to be met before you can say that it is a fatty liver. And the criteria are, the liver echogenicity should be more than the renal cortex, as you can see here. RC is the renal cortex there. So you have to compare it to renal cortex before saying that it is a fatty liver. And there should be a vascular blurring. These two criteria should be met before you can say it is a fatty liver. So the radiologists have to be careful before saying that it is a fatty liver. As I was saying, liver biopsy is a clinical standard. Conventional ultrasound is the routine that most of our patient comes with. CT scan is not favored because of ionizing radiation, and MRI PDFF has become the standard, which currently FDA regards as a gold standard for accepting all its drug evaluation. The current, if you are doing a drug trial in US, you must have an MRI PDFF before you are allowed to consider whether it is working or not. If you look at the epidemiology of NFLD, the global prevalence of fatty liver is around 21%. The highest prevalence is in South America and the Middle East. Prevalence in North America is around 20% and it is increasing. In the Western Europe, it is about the same. If you look at the prevalence in India, you might be thinking that in India the prevalence is a bit less because we are socioeconomically backward. But you look at the literature here, In Haryana, rural area, which was a study from AIIMS, the prevalence is 30%. In Nanded, which is in Maharashtra, the prevalence is 28%. Amrapurkar, which is Bombay, it was a railway hospital in Bombay, it is 15%. In Odisha, it is one of the teaching hospitals in Odisha, it was 24%. So the prevalence is almost the same as in the West. If you look at the metabolic abnormalities which are associated with fatty liver, hyperlipidemia, obesity, metabolic syndrome, hypertension, hypertriglyceridemia, diabetes, 20%. So all of these are associated with fatty liver. Just a word about the diagnosis. Before making a diagnosis of fatty liver disease, you have to make sure that the patient is not drinking, as I mentioned in the diagnosis beforehand, how to make a diagnosis, and you have to rule out other causes of liver disease. In our country, you have to understand that hepatitis B prevalence is about 3%, hepatitis C prevalence is about 1%. So you have to take a history, you have to make a diagnosis, you have to exclude hepatitis B, you have to exclude hepatitis C, and you have to take a drug history just to make sure that that is not responsible for fatty liver, because there are certain drugs which can cause fatty liver. There is a spectrum of fatty liver. One is a plain, bland fatty liver disease, another is a steatohepatitis, and another is an advanced steatohepatitis or cirrhosis. You see, a majority of the patients, as I said, the prevalence is 25% in the population if you think, a majority of them remains as a stable bland steatosis, 75%. Only a fourth of them, 25%, go on to progress to steatohepatitis, and 25%. Out of this 25%, a fourth of them develop progressive fibrosis. So if you think of it, a majority of the patients with fatty liver disease, they remain in a fatty liver disease state. Only a very minority of them will progress. And now this go on to develop steatohepatitis. And a very few of these steatohepatitis patients will go on to develop progressive fibrosis and cirrhosis. So if you take 100 individuals, 25% or 25 will have fatty liver, about 6 will develop NASH, and 1 or probably 2 will develop NASH with fibrosis over time. So out of 100, only 1 will develop progressive disease. So it is a very, very small minority which will develop progressive disease. That you will have to keep in mind. And you will have to reassess. And if you look at the rate of progression of fibrosis or advancement of the disease, it is 0.13 stage per year. And so for one stage development, it takes about 7 to 8 years. And there are 4 stages of fibrosis development, from F1 to F4. F4 is cirrhosis. So it takes decades for cirrhosis to develop. So it is a very slowly progressive disease. So it takes years and years for progression to cirrhosis to happen. That is what you have to keep in mind. This is a very long-term 28-year follow-up Swedish study, as you can see here. And it looked at the survival of patients of fatty liver disease. And it looked at these people were biopsied at the start of their journey and at the end. And what it found was only people who had advanced fibrosis, they had decreased survival. People who had bland steatosis, who had just fat in their liver, without any inflammation or without any fibrosis, they did not have any decreased survival. So what determined the survival of the patients was fibrosis in the liver. So it is the fibrosis which is important, and not just the fat. So it is important to determine which patients have fibrosis in their liver, because that will determine whether they are going to have a decreased survival or not. And this again shows you that the degree of fibrosis, those who have stage 4 fibrosis here, as you can see, those who have stage 4 fibrosis here have decreased survival, and stage 3 fibrosis who have a decreased survival. So as the stage of fibrosis increases, their survival decreases. Those who have early stage fibrosis, they don't have decreased survival compared to people who do not have fibrosis. So on multivariate analysis, people have found in various studies that only significant fibrosis, grade 3 or more fibrosis, is a predictor of mortality. And a significant, what mortality is important? It is a cardiovascular related death. So what do these people die of? They do not die. The commonest cause of death in these patients is cardiovascular death. You can understand if you look at the risk factors. All the risk factors that I have told you beforehand are the risk factors for cardiovascular disease as well. So most of them die not of liver related illnesses. Most of the cause of death is cardiovascular related death. So the commonest cause of death is cardiovascular related death, liver related death, and there's increased risk of extrahepatic malignancy. And they have twice the normal risk of cardiovascular death compared to normal population. So as I said, the most important thing is to find out who will progress. Because if you look at it, what I have told you is 25% of the population have fat in their liver. So it's a huge number of patients who will come to you with fat in their liver. You will have to try and find out who will progress. You have to try and identify the patients who will progress, and you will have to try and screen them, because you cannot screen the whole population because it's a huge number from a population perspective. So how can you identify patients of fatty liver who have fibrosis? Liver biopsy is the gold standard, but you can't, you will not be able to subject everybody who have got fat in the liver to a liver biopsy. So there has to be something else. So there are certain risk factors. These are the red flags for risk of progression to advanced fibrosis. People who are older than 45, who are obese, who have a diabetes, and if you look at their liver numbers, if their AST, ALT ratio is more than 1, if they have a metabolic syndrome, especially hypertension, they have increased risk of developing fibrosis. So these are the risk factors which you look for, and if the patients have these, then they should be screened. And there are certain non-invasive tests for liver fibrosis. There are various clinical or lab tests like NAFLD fibrosis score, which is available in the net, FIB4 score, BARD AST-ALT ratio, and there are certain imaging modalities like FibroScan, you must have heard about it. And there are MRI-based tests, which I have mentioned just now. I'll just mention you a FIB4 index. You see, it is a simple test. It is available, all of us have a smartphone. You can download it from the net. It is a simple app. And you can feed age, AST, ALT, and platelet count, and it will give you a number. And it has been studied in, a lot of studies have been done. The initial study was in 541 patients, and if you look at the area under the curve, it is 0.8, which is fairly good. And if it will give you a number, and if the number is less than 1.3, then the chances of fibrosis is very low. And if the number is more than 2.6, it is the patient has an advanced fibrosis. So anything less than 1.3, he doesn't have a fibrosis. And if the number is more than 2.6, he has got advanced fibrosis. So you can calculate this with quite easily in those patients whom you think has got chance of progression. And another modality is FibroScan. You must have heard about it. It is like a ultrasound, a special kind of ultrasound machine, and it is a bedside test. It is a point of care machine, and you can use it, and it will give you a number. Again, a number will tell you whether it will give you a number, and it is good for, again, determining whether the patient has a mild or no fibrosis or advanced fibrosis. It is not good for determining whether the patient has a moderate fibrosis or increasing fibrosis, but the number will tell you whether the patient has very little fibrosis or no fibrosis, or a very advanced fibrosis or cirrhosis. But it has some limitations, like if the patient is obese, very obese, or if he has ascites. Let us come to treatment. Unfortunately, let me come to the most difficult bit, lifestyle modification. Weight loss is the most important thing in treatment of NASH. If you can lose 10% of your body weight, it has been shown to improve liver histology and fibrosis. So just think of it, just 10% of your body weight, if you lose. It has been shown in various trials, just losing 10% of your body weight will improve your fibrosis, it will improve your liver histology, it will improve your liver number. Okay? So if you weigh 85 kilos, you lose 8 kilos. Exercise. It has been shown that exercise improves insulin resistance and helps weight loss. And reduced calories helps in any way, really. Let me come to drugs. Unfortunately, we haven't advanced much over here in the last few years. There are exciting times ahead, but still we are far behind. This was a seminal trial in this field. It is called PIVENS trial. It was sponsored by NIH. In this trial, non-diabetics were given vitamin A 800 milligram a day and pioglitazone 30 milligram a day and placebo. And it was found at the end of the trial period that vitamin A 800 milligram a day was associated with a significant improvement in histology, but not fibrosis. Pioglitazone was associated with some improvement in histology, but not significant improvement in histology. But the secondary endpoints with pioglitazone were met. So at the end of the trial, they concluded vitamin E was superior to placebo in adult with NASH and without diabetes. Pioglitazone may have a role in treating patients with biopsy-proven NASH. However, long-term safety and efficacy has not been established because, as you all know, pioglitazone is associated with weight gain, and NASH itself, or fatty liver disease, is associated with a weight problem as such. Metformin, you would think that since it is an insulin resistance problem, metformin might be useful in this. There have been numerous trials with metformin, but it has not been found to be useful in NAFLD. This is the drug which is most commonly used in fatty liver, UDCA. If you ask my colleagues here, 7 out of 10 will use it. It has found to be of no benefit at all. There have been numerous trials. There's no point, and it has been shown time and again that it has no benefit in fatty liver disease. Liraglutide, a GLP-1 analog, in a small clinical trial, it has been shown to improve liver histology, and it was concluded at the end of this trial that the observed effects were independent of weight loss, because you can see there was some weight loss at the end of its use. There has been subsequent trials with it, and there are other trials going on with an orally active GLP-1 analog called semaglutide, and we are expecting a phase 2 result next year with it. SGLT2, there are small trials with SGLT2, mainly Japanese study, which has shown some improvement in liver numbers and histology, but most of the experts in this field, they think that SGLT2 works basically in this by reducing weight rather than any effect on the liver. So if you look at the current recommendation, control obesity or weight, reduce cardiovascular risks, you can use vitamin A, pioglitazone, and there is some benefit of metformin, simvastatin, as far as reducing HCC risk. I have not touched HCC risk here. There are quite a few exciting molecules on the horizon, because as you can understand, there are lots of individuals, patients, suffering from this, in the West especially, because obesity is increasing by leaps and bounds there. So there are various drugs like obeticholic acid. I will come to that. There are PPAR receptor agonists. As I mentioned, pioglitazone, elafibranor, and saroglitazole is a new drug, which is an Indian molecule, which has been licensed for certain use in diabetes, and it is undergoing some trial in Mexico in NFLD patients. And we are expecting some results next year in NFLD. Elafibranor is undergoing phase 3 trial, and we are expecting results this year. Obeticholic acid is undergoing phase 3 trial. Again, we are expecting results this year. The problem with obeticholic acid, it came with a bang, but the problem has been with some lipid metabolism. It increases cholesterol in certain individuals, and pruritus is a problem with it. So currently the recommendation is you can use vitamin E, and you can use pioglitazone probably in diabetics, but you have to keep in mind the weight problem. So the take-home message is NFLD is a liver manifestation of probably a systemic disease, a metabolic problem, as increasing in incidence. It has tremendous economic and clinical burden to the society, which is rapidly growing globally. It is associated with increased mortality, primarily from cardiovascular and liver disease. Insulin resistance is thought to be the primary disorder. Lifestyle modification, weight loss, target 10%. With exercise is the most effective treatment currently available. Though it is difficult to sustain, getting 10%, but continuing with 10% is difficult, because as soon as you stop exercising, you regain the weight. Currently available drugs are not very effective, though a large number of drugs are in pipeline.
Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful detailed discussion. With this, we move on to the prize question. Sir, please announce the question.
So the prize question is, what is an important cause of death? What is not an important cause of death in a patient of NFLD? Liver failure, renal failure, cardiac disease, malignancy.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Malignancy? No?
No,
Yes, ma'am.
Liver failure?
no,
It's renal failure, sir.
right. Gaurav. Dr. Gaurav Kumar.
We have a prize for you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. And we move on to our honorable chairpersons to share your valuable comments with us.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Dilip Todi, for your excellent and lucid deliberate explanation about the fatty liver disease. And I would like to request our august audience to place any question if they have any.
Yes, sir.
Always a pleasure to ask questions to you from an authority on liver disease. Now, one point I want to mention about the recent concept of so-called gut-liver axis and importance of gut microbiome, what is called the dysbiosis of the gut. And sometimes this dysbiosis is very much responsible for all sorts of liver disease, not only NFLD, yes, but also. So, management of this gut dysbiosis perhaps can be helpful in our understanding.
Yes, people are looking at it, as you said, in all liver disease. We are looking at gut dysbiosis as a cause which perpetuates the liver disease. And there are clinical trials which are going on looking at the progress of liver disease, especially in people who have fibrosis, whether gut dysbiosis, what we call that translocation of gut bacteria into the liver, whether it increases the fibrosis in the liver and causes this increase in liver fibrosis and cirrhosis. There are various clinical trials going on with especially rifaximin in very small, low doses, extended release rifaximin, whether it prevents the progression of this liver disease or not. Similarly, we are thinking that gut dysbiosis is responsible for a lot of things now, not only liver disease. A lot of other disease we think are responsible for gut dysbiosis. NFLD is like a metabolic disease, and I'm sure we will come to there will be certain gut dysbiosis because there is a gut microbiome or a stool tests in which a particular kind of bacterial signature has been described for cirrhotics who have got hepatic encephalopathy. So it suggests that there are certain types of bacteria which are present more in these people which are not present in general population. So I'm sure in future we will hear more about it.
Your slide that 46% of NAFLD patients were obese. So normal body weight person and lean and thin, they are not immune from NAFLD. So what is prevalence in them? Normal body weight and lean body weight, or those who are having malnutrition?
You see, not everybody who has got fatty liver has got obesity. Normal people can have fatty liver as well. By normal people, I mean people with normal weight. Because you see, what you have to understand is obesity criteria, our criteria for obesity, which is based on BMI is not very accurate. There was a paper in Lancet, which was a very old paper. It was in late 80s. And it was a very interesting paper in which an Indian diabetologist and a diabetologist from UK, they had published their picture. Their BMI was exactly the same. It was 21.9 or something. And they had taken their CT scan, abdominal CT scan, and it had shown their fat distribution. And if you look at the fat distribution of an Indian diabetologist was entirely different from the fat distribution of the British diabetologist, though their BMI was exactly the same. So what I'm trying to say is, it does not always tell you the fat distribution of the patient. The weight does not always tell you the fat distribution of the patient. So the obesity, the definition of the obesity is not entirely the required definition of obesity that we think of, for Indian population especially. Yes. Yes, Vijay.
Frequently refer these patients. Like those patients who have got ALT more than 3 times and they have a significant dyslipidemia, like hypercholesterolemia. Can we prescribe statin? If yes, which statin can we do? This is one. And second, any comment regarding the recent trials, just like PCSK9 on fibroblast growth factor 21?
Sorry?
Fibroblast growth factor 21, like pegbalfermin, just like PCSK9 injectables are coming in NAFLD.
You see, I can answer your first question very easily. It has been shown time and again that statins are very safe. Whatever the ALT level, you can easily use statin. It has been clearly shown that you can use statin. There's no problem in using statin. In fact, you might find that once you use statin, their ALT might come down even a bit. So you can use whatever statin you want to use, and it is safe to use. And the second question, I could not understand your question. The newer anti-cholesterol drug you are talking about. And what was the question?
Yeah, how does it work in NAFLD? Like,
I have no idea. Sorry, I don't know the answer. Yeah.
This is a very common question. Pioglitazone increases the enzyme level, SGBT level. And in NAFLD pioglitazone, particularly PPI gamma agonist, they are given, but is there any cutoff level when we can't give the pioglitazone?
Sorry?
Cutoff dose, any cutoff dose of pioglitazone, which we can't use. Same dose or lower dose, anything, any modification of the dose?
Wow, okay. There is, you see, pioglitazone in clinical trials, there is no, because in NAFLD trial, the pioglitazone you can use it. There is no, as such, there is.
There is trial. There is trial with pioglitazone.
There are NASH trials with pioglitazone. The PIVENS trial is with pioglitazone, the trial I showed you, and you can use pioglitazone. I don't know if there is any cutoff level above which you cannot use pioglitazone.
Is there any role of statin in NAFLD? Is there any role of statin?
As I mentioned in one of the there have been initially a few trials on statins, but statins have been thought to be more effective in causing so-called HCC chemo prevention. They do not directly act on fatty liver disease, but there is some role, probably they tend to decrease the HCC chance of your getting HCC in patients of NAFLD.
Does pioglitazone can cause the hypoglycemia in a normal patient if you use the pioglitazone for the...
There wasn't any hypoglycemic episode in that trial, in the PIVENS trial.
With this, we have to move on to our next scientific session. I thank our honorable speaker, Dr. Dilip Todi, and our honorable chairpersons, Dr. Buddhadev Mukherjee and Dr. Shoykot Ghosh. With this, we move on to the third part of our scientific session, which goes as an update on thromboembolic disorders in diabetes. And the speaker for this topic is Dr. Munna Das, who is an interventional cardiologist with special interest in cardiac electrophysiology, who is attached to Narayana Super Speciality Hospital. And for this session, I would like to invite our chairpersons, Dr. Mridul Bera, who is an energetic and enthusiastic medical practitioner attached to Narayana Super Speciality Hospital, and Dr. Shibananda Dotto, who is a cardiac specialist, ex-HOD IPG MER, and he is currently attached with Narayana Super Speciality Hospital. I would like to invite our speaker and chairpersons on the dais.
Bapu,